Thank you, James. And I express my thanks to be invited to this conference. I'm very honored with it. And I also express my great thanks for the Erika and her team for the great organization of this conference. Okay, so today's my paper is a person called Tamijuro Kume, and a small Theosophical lodge in Tokyo, Japan, settled in the 1920s. And but first I'd like to explain two issues. First, my purpose today is not to present you the overall picture of International Lodge Tokyo. Recent studies enable us to figure out several facts that were unknown to us before, but some important pieces are still missing. I shall concentrate on one member of the lodge, a Japanese painter, Tamijuro Kume, to reveal his spiritual pilgrimage across the globe, thereby locating this lodge precisely in the cultural context of the interwar Japan. Fortunately, I've heard my research colleague Helena Chapkova is going to publish the study on the lodge before long. I know her study is based on the document she has found in the archive in Adyar, Madras, so hopefully it will fill the gap of our ignorance. The International Lodge Tokyo was a third attempt to organize a Theosophical lodge in Japan. This was a small cell of the Theosophical Society founded by an Irish poet, James Cousins. So many of you are aware of this person, James H. Cousins. Cousins' name was mentioned by Dr. Chang's speech just before, and he was once active in Irish literary revival movement at the turn of the century, and later devoted himself into the women's suffrage with his wife Margaret in England, and accepting Annie Besant's invitation, came to India in 1915, where he was closely related with the T.S. educational affairs. It is officially reported that he came to Japan to teach English literature in Keio Gijuku University, a prestigious private university in Tokyo. But this is true only partially. During his 1.5 year stay in Japan, he was profoundly involved with Japan's nationalistic movement, one of whose purpose is to destabilize English dominance in Indian subcontinent. I'm very sorry to say that I have no time to talk about this in detail, but he was closely involved with the Japanese right-wing movement. And as Dr. Chan said just before, he contributed greatly of the editing and issuing the English magazine called Asian Review. It was a propaganda organ to show the Japanese pan-Asianism to the world, especially to the area where Japanese invaded and occupied region in Asia. And Cousins and other Westerners helped the publication of that journal greatly. And very interesting, other person is a Frenchman called Paul Richard. Someone knows that Paul Richard was once partner Mila Alfassa, later went to India and to be a disciple of the Sri Aurobindo. And turned herself into a personality called the Mother. The Mother personality, Bishop, was, what should I say, making a collaboration with James H. Cousins to assist the Japanese right-wing movement. This is very interesting subject, but unfortunately I have no time to discuss this. So in this regard, his foundation of International Lodge Tokyo is not entirely free from political motive. When the invitation reached him from Japanese university, he was one of the major editors of New India, peasants' official organ to support India's Home Rule League, and giving up this post without peasants' consent is unlikely. Cousins' position as an unofficial delegate of peasant seems to have been known to some extent when he came to Japan. I think the International Lodge Tokyo was the third attempt. These lists you can see on the screen include the lodges that were launched in Japan before World War II. The one is closely related to Colonel Olcott. Olcott visited Japan 4 times, and he was enthusiastically welcomed in the first 2 visits. He lecture toured in every corner of Japan and established a lot of small lodges. Most of them were probably registered in ADIA headquarters officially, but no one has ever studied it so far. But later years' material strongly suggests that none of them survived. Number 2, a lodge, the man called Stevenson founded in small town near Tokyo is remarkable in terms that it alone belonged to Point Roma, not Adia. And the effort it made in propagating theosophy in Japan was rewarded to a certain extent. Documents stored in Point Roma archive reveal that several eminent personalities like Imperial Navy officers or industrialists privately visited the American headquarters. I have seen the pictures of such a Japanese person visit to many institutes of Point Roma, especially visiting to the Greek theater just before James mentioned. But plenty of these lodges are still unknown, in particular when it became inert and vanished silently. And the lodges from number 4 to 6 are the offspring of the number 3, some of which I shall refer to in this paper if necessary. For Opel's lodge is likely to have succeeded the international future its mother lodge had. A French chemist, Saint-Hilaire, left Japan in 1924 for India to join Aurobind Ashram, and found Labaton, who received responsibility from him, was a Dutch theosophist who acted in Dutch colony in Java, Australia, and later US. This man, Labaton, was family member of the Frank Gilder James mentioned just before, and I think he finished his last part of life in Crotona or somewhere there, and he acted as a member to solve the Japanese, during the World War II, he acted in the department of the decoding the Japanese code Enigma, because he knew Japanese very well. I'm not sure, but I heard that. And number 5, Mahayana Lodge is a society consisted of Japanese Buddhist scholars, and it was organized by D.T. Suzuki and his wife Beatrice. And Milok Lodge survived longest, probably even after the World War II, but fewer known except its activity closely associated with the Order of the Star in the East. Actually, I introduced this risk a few years before when Vishwanathan and others held a conference in Columbia University, New York in 2015. But I have to confess that the research on it showed no considerable progress since then. The foundation years of most of the lodges are known or able to guess, but it's hard to find how long they survived. No lodge is sustainable enough to trace its development with certainty, at least in the level of the document written in Japanese. This means they gradually lost their vigor they had in the Genesis days and rapidly dwindled once strong leadership was missed. I'm sure that the history of the Theosophy would not follow this way. But the International Lodge Tokyo was exceptional in terms that it left 3 successor lodges. Noticeable in common amongst lodges in Japan is that they were planted in Japanese soil by the hands of a Westerner, thrived rapidly by the assistance of Japanese companions, but withered once the founder passed away or left Japan. Another point is that those supporting the founder were the Japanese, who are well versed in Western culture and languages. They are elite natives who form the upper layer of the Japanese society and held little or no direct connection with the majority of the population. In this sense, Japan showed a sharp contrast to the countries such as India, where the impact of the Theosophical Society went deeper into the bottom of the society due to the vigorous campaign those native elites made towards a subservient mass population. The demarcation between Western or Westernized elite and the indigenous locals were recognized as early as the founder James Cousin wrote to ADL headquarters, quote, "The Tokyo International Lodge is intended to link up outlying students and foreigners and be a mother lodge for fellows until local lodges can be formed," unquote. The parallelism with the early Indian lodges must have been in his mind when he wrote this, but the case did not develop in Japan as in India, where the highly educated locals surrounded the founders' Westerners made an effort to permeate philosophy deeper into their fellow Indians. The greatest barrier Japanese lodges faced with in their operation was the language. Even in 1930, more than a decade after the inauguration of the International Lodge Tokyo, one of its successors, Miloku Lodge, was divided into international section and Japanese section, and its honorary secretary, E.M. Keishi, wrote, quote, "A small group is now meeting for the closer study of philosophical doctrine in English. The lack of translation into Japanese language is a great handicap, but the difficulty of translation is many," unquote. The Miloku Lodge was diverted from the original body with the purpose of propagating Krishnamurti's doctrine to common Japanese. Miloku means Maitreya in Japanese. And the existence of 2 sections, even in that society, clearly suggests that wide gap separating common Japanese members from leading Westerners. As shown in Cousin's words I quoted just before, the International Lodge Tokyo was set up not for common Japanese, but for foreigners who visited and left Japan through international networks crisscrossed across the world. This means that although the membership was a mixture of Japanese and other nationals, the Japanese members were those who held the exceptional career of once having been or possibility of staying in future in the world outside Japan. So let us see the case of Buhei-kon, the leading member of the lodge and later the first president of Miloku Lodge. In the Theosophical literature, he is frequently mentioned Captain Kon And this is because he was a steamship captain of NYK, the largest shipping company then and even now in Japan. He was acquainted with Besant and Leadbeater when his vessel stayed in Madras port. Presumably, it was on the way from London and sought refuge there from the raiding of German cruiser Emden in Indian Ocean. I'm not sure if Kon knew cousins before the later came to Japan in 1919, but it is unlikely if considering Kon's registration to the TS Fellowship was made on December 1919, just a few months before the International Lodge Tokyo was initiated. Susceptible is that he was going to be the first president of the International Lodge Tokyo, but due to the reason unknown to us, the post was handed over to D.T. Suzuki, later known worldwide scholar of Zen Buddhism. Japanese nationals occupied a majority of the Japanese nationals occupied a minority in 24 founding members who registered by the end of 1920, and this explains properly what international means in this lodge. Few foreign members remain long in Japan. Amongst Japanese members, we can find T. Kume, the painter I'm going to discuss today. Although a native Japanese, he traveled far into Western world, and his several years stay in London, New York, and Paris certifies his internationality. But his life was too short to produce something concrete. In spite of the lack of primary sources, we can presume the reason he entered the TS with some certainty. His best friend, Jack Blinkley, a half-Japanese Englishman, had been an active member of the TS for many years, probably since the year before World War I, and his sister, Ine Blanche, Kume's ex-fiancée, entered the International Lodge a few weeks later. Kume's contribution to the lodge is believed to be little, considering of his immediate departure for the United States. The point we should be attentive to is that his involvement into the International Lodge Tokyo was likely the consequence of the interest in mediumship he cultivated in his 2 years stay in London from 1914. No evidence is in our hand to reveal when this interest of his started, whether it was arose before or after his first visit to Europe, but one thing certain is that this interest in spiritualism was compatible with his profound knowledge of No, Japanese traditional mystical stage performance. Many of the characters of a No play are spiritual entities, and the dialogue with the deceased, visiting us from the other world, is a major factor to propel a No play, No story. The world of No play is established upon assuming human post-mortem existence. Even in the years when the International Lodge Tokyo was founded, the No was a cultural asset facilitated only for the upper layer of Japanese society, and as often observed in the case of traditional art holding a long historical backdrop, profound knowledge of the mannerism of a No play, together with long years discipline as an actor and singer, was necessary to understand the delicate expressions performed on the stage. Kume was the person who satisfied all the conditions of these. His father, Taminosuke Kume, was a successful industrialist and a lower house MP, and as a descendant of feudal samurai class, he loved the No plays too much to build a personal No theater in the corner of his huge property, where his eldest son Tamijuro was trained as a No performer since childhood days. This capacity endowed to Tamijuro was necessary for Ezra Pound and W.B. Yeats when in 1915, they tried in London to stage a performance consisted of a digested parts of various no plays. The first person they contacted was a Japanese dancer, Michiro Ito. But Ito was by no means versed well with a no-stage mannerism. To compensate his ignorance, Ito called on Kume, who once was his classmate in the senior high school of Piers College in Japan. Thus, Kume was involved into the literary circle in London, where Yeats and then his secretary, Pound, were the central figures. And Kume's friendship with Pound lasted long until the day of his tragic death. Complicated biographical context should not be taken into consideration here. What's important here is one, Pound was trying to make public Ernest Philonosa's unpublished studies on No with his own notes added to it, and Kume's technical advice was necessary for publishing the volume No or Accomplishment, a study of classical stage of Japan in 1970. Two, Yeats was writing the No to Lady Gregory's Visions and Beliefs in West of Ireland. And this was nothing but a spiritualistic interpretation of a mediumistic ability of Irish peasantry. Yeats' understanding of Irish folklore was too occultist to stand his secretary, Pound, but we can't ignore that Lady Gregory's idea of collecting folk tales itself was to figure out such paranormal capacity amongst her own people, and behind her idea existed a hypothesis that strange phenomena such as peasant witnessing fairies is a manifestation of an innate capacity of human being, and capacity is demonstrated more distinctively amongst uncivilized people like rural Irish farmers. Her idea itself was stimulated by expedition the Society of Psychical Research made in remote regions of Scotland at the end of the 19th century. But unfortunately, we have no idea to discuss it in detail. As mentioned earlier, Yeats wrote a detailed note to her book. For instance, considering a case which tells fairy abduction, Yeats tries to contextualize these Irish cases into a wider stream by discussing extensively the degree of trance or spirit possession, the phenomena of someone haunted divine entities, and in this discourse, the evidence he heavily relies on is occult Japan, the collection of religious surveys an American astronomer, Percival Lowell, made during his 5-time stay in Japan between 1889 to 1893. Lowell's emphasis on the possession right for the mountain ascetic monks who gathered at the sacred mountain on Take is worthy to note. Most likely, this type of the knowledge Yeats had when writing the note to Irish oral narratives made decisive impact on Pound's interpretation of No performance. Pound developed the analog with mediumship in many places when interpreting the No works he chose for his publication. Quote, "These plays are full of ghosts, and the ghost psychology is amazing. The parallels with Western spiritist doctrine are very curious," unquote. What Pound's term ghost psychology meant can be understood by the comment he wrote for a No work, Tsunemasa. Tsunemasa is a quote, "Tsunemasa is a gentle and melancholy. It is all in high tension, but it is a psychological tension, the tension of the seance. The excitement and triumph are the nervous excitement and triumph of successful ritual. The spirit is invoked and appears," unquote. The greatest reason of Pound's and perhaps Yeats' appreciation of Kume is that he was the only person available for them who could make use of spiritualist concept and terminology such as seance or possession in explaining what it meant in Japanese culture. And Kume's interpretation benefited greatly when Pound understood No's ghost psychology, and consequently when Yeats wrote his mystical drama at the Hawkswell. Therefore, Pound wrote many years later thus, quote, Tami knew something of No that no mere philologist can find out from textbook, unquote. When the news of Kume's sudden death reached to him in 1923, Pound was disturbed greatly, and later he recalled it thus, quote, Since Tami Kume was killed in that earthquake, I had no one to explain the obscure passages or fill up the enormous gap of my ignorance, unquote. This consideration inevitably leads us to further question how and when Kume was familiar with the idioms of Western-styled spiritualism. Unfortunately, no evidence is available to ensure that he was strongly interested in mediumship before his first visit to Western world in 1914. Likewise, we have nothing to know how he learned it in London or which spiritualist circle he contacted with there. Only clue we have is that he knew Georgette Louvain before returning home in 1980. Georgette Louvain was many years mistress to Belgian playwright Maurice Maeterlinck, and they shared profound interest in spiritism with each other. Kume might have been acquainted with some French circles. In the years after 1919, his comments on the spiritualism suddenly became frequent. We are not able to remove the possibility that some activity in the International Lodge Tokyo inspired him. This still remains unwarranted information, but presumably a seance was held several times in the lodge, whose central figure was a Ukrainian lady called Countess Ina Metaxa. Probably some of you might know her. We hope some decisive evidence to certify this will emerge soon. In 1920, replying to the newspaper's interview, Kume defined himself as a Lathyrist artist. Lathyrist is a term he invented to explain the painting style of his own, and lei, Japanese word for spirit, and ether were combined to create the word. Fortunately, the manifesto he published in English still remains, and in a statement entitled The Art of Atheism, or Spiritico Etheric Art, we can read these passages. Quote, so even the color forms that are not reflected on the retina of the eyes can be seized at the phonics of the brain. Some person in whom their spiritual sensation is highly developed can insensitively represent or perceive them, just as forms that are not made visible by means of prismatic spectrum can be seized by ultraviolet rays of the spectrum, unquote. So even if all the material available combined, how racism concerned with the spiritualist scheme or procedures is still ambiguous, although allusion to trance and spirit position are sometimes emphasized in different places. Kume seems to want people to understand that the racism was a method to illustrate the artist himself saw in a mediumistic trance, or what the medium expressed while spiritually possessed. At any rate, Lathyrist painting is to express something a man, whether it be an artist or a medium, perceived in the altered state of consciousness. In this context, the impact Kume received from Theosophist thought form theory seems obvious. it's almost certain that he read the book written by Besant and Leadbeater, and James Cousins' high appreciation of Kume's painting indirectly supports my assumption. Evidences concerning the history of psychical research in Japan are by no means collected satisfactorily, and accumulation of the reports is quite distorted. Its introduction is well documented, whereas the later history is widely ignored and scantily studied. This is chiefly due to the ban Japanese academia imposed on the psychical research in 1914, when the series of experiments of clairvoyance conducted by the psychology professor of Tokyo Imperial University, Tomokichi Fukurai, so his experiment was sensationally reported in mass media, and fraudulent interventions were strongly suspected by his colleague scientists. The psychical research in Japan was not entirely extinct, but carried on by a handful of non-official students, and whose works we have little means to refer to nor to review comprehensively. One thing certain is that they came from a higher strata of Japanese society, and this is ensured by the fact that they were educated highly enough to follow the contemporary affairs taking place in the spiritualist world in Western countries. Conversely, their study had little or nothing to do with the ordinary people's spirituality, howsoever they were hardworking in evidencing the post-mortem existence. We are sure that Kume was befriended with at least one of such psychical researchers when he published the Laicism Manifesto, but other evidences makes us suggest that he was known to some extent to spiritualist circle then active in Japan. Fukurai's interest in clairvoyance, thoughtography in his own term, was initiated by the emergence of amateur psychics among common people. Most of the subjects of Fukurai's thoughtography experiment were ordinary housewives. However, their emergence was by no means accidental, but can be located in the stream of mind cure movement, forming a great spiritual fashion among mass population of interwar Japan. The movement originated in this movement originated in the import of mesmerism to Japan. Nevertheless, actual mesmeric practices merged soon with indigenous methods of mediumship. Those spiritual healing skills succeeded from many generations in the guise of Buddhist or Shintoist meditation in pre-modern world, and those unauthorized therapists in the early 20th century forgot Western origin in no time. Indeed, specific terms like ether or yogic chakra were sometimes used to explain the process of their healing, but actually they only rephrase the traditional Taoist theory of energy flow, the imaginary fluid circulated inside human bodies. This perception of spirituality is genuinely native. The type of spirituality Percival Lowell was fascinated by and recorded in his Occult Japan, and had little or no connection with Western study of psychology or psychical research. The wide distance stretched out between psychical researchers and mind curers accurately reflects social separation solidly fixed between two clusters of pre-war Japan society. The difference I mentioned shortly before. The culture dominant amongst the common people was stiffly self-reliant and paid little attention to culture product that is welcome in the higher level, probably because lower level culture kept strong continuity with the world before modernization. Advanced knowledge of Western culture was eagerly studied and digested by the minority elites, but although they were bound with the obligation of leading their own lesser fellows to a direction of development, such a knowledge was rarely transferred to and never appreciated by the rest of the population. French, Italian opera, German expressionist stage setting, communalism initiated by Russian author Tolstoy, and even Marxism. We can extend the list endlessly. Psychical research was not exception, and theosophy was so. No wonder any attempts of theosophist lodges ended up with a miserable breakdown. Unlike the case in India, the Japanese member failed to permeate theosophical idea together with TS ideal principles deep into this massive cluster. Kume's connection with religious society Tairedo is remarkable in terms of forming an exceptional case of interaction between these two clusters. As mentioned before, the dominance of mind cure was conspicuous in interwar Japan, but no comprehensive study on those spiritual healers has ever been conducted. The memory of their existence itself was lost after World War II, and a document recording them are unheeded and extensively dispersed. The variety of the mind curers is so expanded, it is almost impossible to sort them out properly, and this is chiefly due to their continual gathering and scattering. Once the fame of a mind curer is widespread, a lot of disciples come to him to learn his way of healing, but they leave their adept as soon as they have mastered it. And thus a new adept was born. In this respect, Morihei Tanaka, a mind curer I'm going to consider in relationship with Kume, is an exceptional case. Tanaka organized his disciple into a religious community called Tairedo, and therefore left a relatively ample variety of documents to refer to. I dare not enter into the details of Tanaka's teaching. His practice is largely consisted of fasting, breathing, certain body postures, and specific means of emanating curing vibration or invisible energy from a palm. This is a practice Tanaka introduced to his disciples using the wooden board called a reishi board. Tanaka assumed the existence of a fine, invisible small substance called reishi, combined word of spirit and monado in Japanese, and insisted that ill-affected body parts are curable if an operator were able to regulate the flow of these substances and guide a stream as to incessantly pour over the weakened part. His theory of reishi was by no means innovative, without any distinctive difference from other mind curers' idea. They should be treated equally in terms of rephrasing all Taoist scheme of body fluid. Kume's name is often mentioned in Tairedo's journal, and his laicism was reported relatively in detail, coupled with his painting of him as a sampler of his clairvoyance. Sad to know that these are too poorly printed on the delegated paper, so to confirm what or how Kume drew is very difficult. This is more sad considering that most of his works, those after he advocated racism, are missing. No document is available to record Kume's own mention to Tairedo, but Tairedo news reporting Kume's visit to newly built headquarters of the society, together with his theosophist friend Jack Brinkley, and this news tempts us to assume that an approach to Tairedo from International Lodge Tokyo was made, or at least attempted to make, but no document has ever been found to support this assumption. One thing certain is that Kume knew something about Tairedo's race theory when writing his manifesto of racism. Let's recall the passage I quoted just before from English version. And we can figure out a strange term, phonics, used there. This word usually refers to an arching, fibrous band of the brain that connects the two lobes of cerebellum. It seems strange for an artist to choose such a medical or anatomist term to explain his aesthetic principle, but the sense of inconsistency is cured once we know that the importance of this body organ was emphasized in certain places of documents related with Taileido's late theory. No evidence has been found so far to certify the clairvoyant view Kume wrote in the manifesto was produced by experiences Taileido's practices, but it is important to notice that the leadership he assumed when writing the manifesto included not only highbrow people well acquainted with Western cultural trends like spiritualism or psychical research, but the Taileido's members, or at least those aware of Tanaka's theory. The popularity of mind cures in interwar Japan is theoretically interpreted as a phenomenon taking place to fill in the vacuum of spirituality initiated by a rapid modernization New Age government commenced just 30 years before. Although ignored or despised officially, the stream was huge and autonomous. Never monitored by Western culture, the intellectuals were eager to introduce to Japan. Certainly, the mind curers frequently insisted that the idea was a mixture of advanced science and traditional spirituality, but that was only the result of their habitual absorption of whatever they wanted to exploit from higher culture. No record exists to certify that serious interaction taking place two clusters of the Japanese society. Kume's approach to Taileido is one and only exception. Probably in his friendship with Pound and Yates, Kume learned the importance of discovering the favor for mediumship amongst uneducated common people, and this turned his eyes to his own people's interest in psychic phenomena. His contact with a broader native stream might have stimulated further cultural hybridity, but his life was too short to precede something important to this direction. In 1923, a day before to his ship's sailing to France, a huge earthquake happened in Tokyo. Kume was killed by the collapse of the hotel he was staying for the departure next day, and all of his works he was going to bring with him were lost. Thank you for your listening.